My sister kidnapped my newborn and fully believes she's justified. I came home from my 12-hour shift to find my 6-month-old daughter missing from her crib and a note from my sister. I'm sorry. I had to take her. Don't trust him. My husband James was already on the phone with 911, pacing frantically, telling them my unstable sister had kidnapped our baby. She's been jealous since Willow was born, he told the officers when they arrived, always making comments about wanting her own kids, trying to undermine us as parents. The nanny cam footage made me sick. 3:14 a.m. My sister Lena carefully lifts Willow from her crib, whispers, "I'm so sorry," over and over, then climbs out the window. She'd used the spare key I'd given her for emergencies. This was betrayal at the deepest level. The Amber Alert went out immediately. Lena's face on every phone in the state. Woman kidnaps infant niece. Considered unstable and dangerous. My parents were devastated. Mom kept saying Lena would never hurt Willow, but the evidence was right there on video. They found my sister at the bus station at 6 a.m., trying to buy tickets with cash. Willow was safe, thank God, wrapped in Lena's coat. The police arrested Lena while she kept screaming, "Check his background. He's not who he says he is." James held me as I sobbed with relief, Willow finally back in my arms. "Your sister needs help," he said. "We should look into restraining orders." But something in Lena's eyes haunted me. The way she'd looked at James when they dragged her away. Not crazy, terrified. At the police station, Lena was allowed one phone call before booking. She called me. "I found his first wife. She's alive. Check the photo album in my apartment bottom drawer." I hung up on her. But at 2 a.m., while James slept and Willow fussed, I drove to Lena's apartment with her spare key. The bottom drawer had a folder. Inside were printed emails from a woman named Monica, claiming to be James's first wife. She wasn't dead like he'd told me. She was living in hiding. She'd reached out to Lena after seeing our wedding announcement online. Her baby had vanished when it was 8 months old. James had disappeared the same night with their savings. There were 3 other women in the emails. 3 other babies. All the babies vanished around 8 months. And all their fathers disappeared immediately after. The women found each other through a private support group for mothers of missing children, and Lena had hired a private investigator. His report was in the folder. Turns out, James Patterson, aka my husband, didn't exist before 2019. No birth certificate, no school records, no employment history. The social security number he used belonged to a child who died in 1991. He was the man taking these babies and disappearing with them, likely selling them. And now he was home alone with our child. In all likelihood, he knew I was onto him. He'd probably taken our baby and ran off to sell her by now. I went into the bathroom to throw up and called the police immediately. They arrived at my house within minutes. They found James in the middle of packing a suitcase. In his car trunk, they found new identity documents and 2 plane tickets. 1 adult, 1 infant. The flight was 3 hours away. "Your sister saved Willow's life," the agent told me. "Or at least saved her from being sold." The Amber Alert meant he couldn't move. He was trapped. When Lena was released, I thought everything was finally over. James was awaiting trial. The search for these missing babies had begun. But yesterday happened. You see, law enforcement requires DNA testing for all recovered children in trafficking cases. Standard procedure to confirm identities and build evidence. Willow's results came back. And she doesn't match my DNA. She doesn't match James's either. "That's impossible," I told the FBI. "I gave birth to her. I remember every second. The emergency case ran. The neonatal intensive care unit. Everything. They checked the hospital records. I did give birth. But the baby I gave birth to had a different blood type than Willow. The IVF clinic I'd used called while I was still processing this. The doctor's voice was shaking. "We need you to come in immediately. There's been a situation with multiple patients." "What kind of situation?" "We're still investigating, but it appears embryos were deliberately switched. Several couples from your treatment cycle are reporting DNA inconsistencies." I looked at Willow sleeping in her crib. The baby I loved more than life itself. The baby my sister risked everything to save. Somewhere out there, another couple might have my biological child. And James is the only person who might know where that couple is. I know he's going to want me to help him in exchange. But I don't care. I got in my car and started driving to jail to talk to him. I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes with both hands locked on the steering wheel, trying to make my breathing slow down and stay even. The jail building looked gray and cold under the afternoon sun, and every time I thought about walking through those doors to face James, my stomach twisted into knots. But he was the only person who knew where my real daughter might be. The baby I actually gave birth to, who was somewhere out there with strangers. I forced myself to open the car door and step out onto the hot pavement. My legs felt shaky as I walked toward the entrance, and I kept thinking about how I was about to make some kind of deal with the man who tried to sell Willow. The guard at the front desk checked my ID and had me sign a visitor log, then pointed me toward a waiting area with plastic chairs bolted to the floor. I sat there for another 10 minutes watching other visitors come and go, mostly tired-looking women with small children. Finally, a different guard called my name and led me down a hallway that smelled like bleach and floor wax. The visit room was small and cold with a metal table in the middle and cameras mounted in every corner. I sat down in one of the chairs and waited, my hands folded tight in my lap to keep them from shaking. The door on the opposite side opened and James walked in wearing orange jail clothes that made his skin look pale. He actually smiled when he saw me, that same easy grin I used to think was charming back when I believed everything he told me. He sat down across from me and leaned forward with his elbows on the table. He started talking right away about how we could help each other, how he had information I needed, and I could help him get better treatment. He said he knew exactly where my biological baby was. knew the whole system of how embryos got switched and babies got sold to rich people who wanted healthy infants. But he wanted his charges reduced from trafficking to something lighter, and he wanted moved to a safer jail where other prisoners wouldn't threaten him. I felt anger building up in my chest like pressure behind my ribs, hot and tight. He was sitting there talking about my daughter like she was just another bargaining chip, another thing he could trade for his own benefit. I told him I wasn't making any deals without the FBI or police present. He shrugged and leaned back in his chair, totally calm. He said that was fine. He had plenty of time to wait while I decided how badly I wanted to find my real child. I stood up without saying anything else and walked to the door. My hands were shaking, so bad I could barely hold the pen to sign out at the front desk. I made it to my car and sat there for a few minutes just breathing, trying to calm down enough to drive. The next morning, I drove to the FBI field office downtown and asked to speak with the agent handling James's case. They put me in a conference room, and 15 minutes later, a woman in her 40s walked in carrying a thick file folder. She introduced herself as Teresa Griffin and shook my hand with a firm grip. She had short brown hair and kind eyes, but her whole manner was serious and no nonsense. I explained what happened at the jail, how James said he knew where my biological daughter was but wanted a deal first. Teresa listened carefully and took notes on a yellow legal pad. She said they could set up what she called a controlled information exchange, where James would have to give them details they could actually check and prove before he got any consideration on his sentence or where they housed him. But she warned me it wouldn't be quick or easy, that these things took time and James might try to string us along. I asked how long it might take, and she said weeks at minimum, possibly months. That felt like forever, but I didn't have any other options. She asked if I was staying somewhere safe, and I told her I'd been at my parents' house since James got arrested. She wrote down their address and phone number and said someone from Victim Services would call me to set up support resources. 2 days later, I got a call from the prosecutor's office saying all charges against Lena were being dropped. They were releasing her with a formal apology for the wrongful arrest. I was sitting in my parents' kitchen when I got the news, and I actually started crying. Mom drove me to pick Lena up from the jail processing area, and when my sister walked out, she looked thin and exhausted. We hugged in the parking lot, and she held on to me so tight I could barely breathe. Back at my parents' house, we sat in the backyard while Lena cried, and I tried to find words that felt big enough. I told her I was sorry for not believing her, sorry she spent time in jail for saving Willow, but the words felt small and hollow compared to what she'd been through. She kept saying she was just glad Willow was safe, glad I finally knew the truth about James. We sat there for a long time not talking, just being together in the afternoon sun. That same afternoon, Teresa came by the house and sat down with me at the kitchen table. She spread out papers and reports explaining the DNA testing process they were using. She showed me documentation proving the IVF clinic problem was real, that at least 6 other families from my treatment cycle were reporting the same kind of DNA mismatches. The scope of what happened made me dizzy. I had to excuse myself twice to go throw up in the bathroom. When I came back, Teresa was still there waiting patiently, and she walked me through everything again more slowly. She explained how they were building legal cases against everyone involved, how the DNA evidence would be crucial for prosecution. I asked if they knew yet who switched the embryos, and she said they had strong leads, but couldn't share details while the investigation was active. Before I left the FBI office that day, Teresa had me sign a huge stack of cooperation forms and agreements. I barely read them, just flipped through page after page, putting my initials and signature where she pointed. I just wanted to move forward with finding my biological daughter, wanted to do whatever it took. Teresa emphasized multiple times that I couldn't contact James on my own, that everything had to go through official channels with lawyers present. I agreed to all of it, feeling like I was signing away pieces of myself but knowing I didn't have a choice. The next day, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a woman's voice said she was Martina Mercier, the director of the IVF clinic. Her voice was shaking as she explained they'd launched a full internal investigation. She admitted they'd found evidence that someone deliberately switched embryos, and she offered to help put me in contact with other affected families from my treatment cycle. I told her I'd think about it, but really I was just trying not to scream at her through the phone. After I hung up, I sat there staring at the wall for a long time. That evening, Teresa showed up at my parents' house again, this time carrying a thick folder. It was the private investigator's report that Lena had paid for, the one that uncovered James's fake identity. We sat at the kitchen table going through every page while my parents hovered nearby. Teresa pointed out key pieces of evidence, explaining how the identity fraud trail was solid and would hold up in court. Seeing it all laid out in black and white made everything feel more real and somehow more horrible. There were photos of documents, printouts of database searches, timelines showing how James appeared out of nowhere in 2019. Each page was another piece of proof that my entire marriage had been built on lies. My parents stayed in the kitchen the whole time Teresa and I worked, bringing us coffee and asking quiet questions. After Teresa left, Mom sat down at the table and started crying. She said she always treated Lena like she was making things up or being too sensitive about everything. Dad put his arm around her shoulders and said they both made mistakes by not taking Lena's concerns seriously over the years. The conversation was painful, but it felt necessary, like finally draining an infected wound that had been festering too long. We talked for hours that night about family patterns and old hurts, about how we needed to do better going forward. It didn't fix everything, but it was a start. 3 days after James's arrest, a woman from CPS knocked on my parents' front door around 10 in the morning. She introduced herself as a caseworker and explained that welfare checks were required protocol for any child involved in a trafficking investigation. I led her upstairs to the room where Willow slept, watching as she inspected the crib setup and checked the window locks. She asked detailed questions about my work schedule at the hospital, who watched Willow during my shifts, what my backup childcare plans were. I answered everything as calmly as I could while Willow played on the floor between us. The caseworker took photos of the sleeping area and made notes on her tablet. She said Willow could stay with me, but there would be regular supervision visits every 2 weeks until the case closed. It felt both reassuring that someone was checking on us, and invasive that my entire life was now under examination. The following week, Teresa picked me up and drove me back to the county jail for a controlled meeting with James. We sat across from him in the same visiting room where I'd confronted him before, but this time Teresa was right beside me taking notes. James looked different, cleaner somehow, like he'd been using the time inside to polish his appearance. He spoke carefully, choosing each word with precision, explaining how these arrangements worked in the fertility industry. He hinted that someone at the clinic had been groomed over time, paid incrementally to swap specific embryos for wealthy buyers who wanted guaranteed healthy infants. The way he discussed it made my stomach turn, like he was describing a business transaction instead of stolen children. He kept his voice calm and professional throughout, never raising it or showing emotion. I gripped the edge of the metal table and tried to keep my face neutral. James leaned back in his plastic chair and folded his hands on the table. He said he'd provide the employee's name and all the contact information for the buyer network, but only if the district attorney reduced his charges from trafficking to fraud. He also wanted a transfer to a facility with better security, because other inmates had been threatening him since word got out about his crimes involving children. He claimed someone had cornered him in the shower area and another inmate had thrown food at him in the cafeteria. Teresa's face stayed completely neutral, but I saw her jaw muscles tighten. She wrote something in her notebook without looking up. James waited for a response, but Teresa just kept writing. Finally, she told him any deal would need to go through proper channels and we'd be in touch. We left without giving him anything. 2 days later, I sat in a conference room at the district attorney's office with Assistant District Attorney Vincent Sutton. He was maybe in his early 30s with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and he spent the first 20 minutes outlining exactly what kind of deal the state could and couldn't offer James. Vincent made it absolutely clear there would be no blanket immunity, and that any agreement depended entirely on James providing information that led to actual recoveries and arrests. He used a lot of legal terms that went over my head, but the basic message came through loud and clear. James wouldn't get everything he wanted, not even close. Vincent explained that trafficking charges carried mandatory minimum sentences, and that fraud charges weren't even on the table given the evidence. The best James could hope for was a recommendation for a specific facility, and maybe some consideration at sentencing if his cooperation proved substantial. I understood enough to know James was trapped, and his only play was to give up everything. That same afternoon, I opened my email and found a message from Martina at the IVF clinic. She was inviting me to a moderated first contact session with other families potentially affected by the embryo switching situation. I stared at the email for over an hour, reading it multiple times, knowing I needed to meet these people but absolutely dreading it. The session was scheduled for the following week via secure video call with a professional moderator present. Martina had attached a consent form and information about what to expect. I finally clicked accept and filled out the forms, my hands shaking the entire time. The thought of meeting other parents whose lives had been destroyed the same way mine had felt overwhelming. Late that night, after my parents went to bed and Willow was asleep, I sat in the nursery with my notebook and started making lists. I wrote down everything that could possibly go wrong. What if my biological daughter was better off where she was with people who loved her? What if the court decided to take Willow away from me? What if James was lying about everything and this was all just another manipulation? What if I found my biological daughter but she didn't want to know me? I filled page after page until my hand cramped so badly I had to stop. Seeing all the fears written out on paper somehow made them feel slightly more manageable, like I could contain them between the lines instead of having them spin around in my head. The next morning, Teresa called to tell me they were setting up a recorded, monitored phone call between me and James, where he'd provide the first round of information. She came over that afternoon and spent an hour prepping me on exactly what to say and not say, what questions to ask, how to stay calm if he tried to manipulate me emotionally. She gave me a script to follow and we practiced it over and over until my voice sounded steady and detached. Teresa emphasized that I needed to stick to the script no matter what James said, that any deviation could compromise the legal process. We rehearsed different scenarios where James might try to get under my skin or make me react. By the time we finished, I felt like I was preparing for a performance rather than a conversation. The monitored call happened that same afternoon in a small room at the FBI field office. Teresa and 2 other agents sat around the table with me, listening on speakers as the jail connected the call. James's voice came through clear and he sounded almost eager to talk. He admitted there was a cloud storage account with coded buyer lists and detailed payment records going back 3 years. He provided a partial username for the IVF clinic accomplice, saying he couldn't remember the full login, but the identifier would be enough for their tech people to find it. His voice had this quality of pride to it, like he was showing off how clever the system had been. He described the coding system they'd used to track embryos and payments, explaining it like he was teaching a class. I followed Teresa's script exactly, asking the specific questions she'd written down, keeping my responses minimal. The whole call lasted maybe 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. Within hours of that call, the FBI's digital forensics team cracked into the cloud account using the information James had provided. Teresa called me that evening while I was feeding Willow dinner to say they'd found detailed payment ledgers and an internal clinic identifier string that should lead them directly to the employee. The speed of it shocked me. I'd expected it to take days or weeks, but they'd broken in almost immediately. I felt this surge of hope followed instantly by dread about what else they might find in those files. Teresa said the forensics team was working through the night to catalog everything, and she'd brief me on the findings as soon as they had a complete picture. I thanked her and hung up, then sat there staring at Willow in her high chair, wondering how many other babies were in those records. The next day, I met Martina in person at a coffee shop about 2 blocks from the clinic. Neither of us wanted to meet at the clinic itself, so we'd chosen neutral ground. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 40s, and she looked like she hadn't slept properly in days. Dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, hands shaking slightly as she held her coffee cup. Martina confirmed that the identifier string from the cloud account matched a former embryology technician who'd left the clinic 6 months ago. She pulled out a tablet and showed me the employee's HR file, pointing to dates and access logs. The woman had unusual after-hours access during the exact window when my IVF cycle was processed. Martina's voice cracked as she explained how the clinic's security protocols should have caught this but didn't. She kept apologizing, but the words felt empty. I asked for the employee's name and current contact information. Martina hesitated, then said the FBI had already instructed her not to share that, because it could interfere with their investigation. I wanted to scream at her, but instead I just nodded and finished my coffee. I drove straight from the coffee shop to the FBI office because Teresa had texted me to come by when I was done with Martina. She met me in the same conference room we'd used before, and spread out printed HR records across the table. The employee file showed a woman named Sarah Hanley, who'd worked as an embryology tech from 2018 to 6 months ago. Teresa pointed to highlighted sections showing Sarah had badge access to the lab at 2:47 a.m. on the exact night my embryos were being prepared for transfer. The access logs showed she was alone in the lab for 43 minutes. Martina's clinic policy required 2 technicians present for all embryo handling, but Sarah had overridden the system using a supervisor code that shouldn't have been assigned to her. Teresa flipped through more pages showing Sarah had similar after-hours solo access on 6 other dates that matched the IVF cycles of other affected families. The pattern was right there in black and white, and I felt anger rising in my chest because this was so obvious. Someone reviewing these logs should have caught it. Someone should have questioned why a junior tech had supervisor override codes. Someone should have noticed the pattern of late-night solo access. But nobody did, and now babies were missing, and my biological daughter was somewhere unknown. I asked Teresa why the clinic's security didn't flag this, and she said they were asking the same question. Apparently the clinic's monitoring system generated alerts for unusual access, but someone had been dismissing them as false positives. They were investigating whether that person was involved or just incompetent. A week after my first jail visit with James, I met Vincent at the prosecutor's office downtown. He had me sign a bunch of forms acknowledging I understood the process, and then he showed me the proffer agreement his office had drafted for James. The document was 20 pages of dense legal language with sections about cooperation requirements, verification standards, and charging considerations. Vincent walked me through the key points. James had to provide specific verifiable information including names, locations, dates, and documentary evidence. Every piece of information would be independently verified before James received any consideration. If James lied or provided false information, the agreement was void, and he'd face the maximum charges. The deal offered potential reduction from trafficking charges to fraud and conspiracy charges, which meant less prison time, but still substantial. Vincent said this structure protected us from James stringing us along with partial truths or false leads. James couldn't just hint at information and expect benefits. He had to deliver actual results that led to recovered children and arrested criminals. I asked how long this would take, and Vincent said it depended entirely on how cooperative James was, and how good his information proved to be. Could be weeks, or could be months. That evening I logged into the Zoom call Teresa had arranged with the Mother's Support Group. 7 women appeared on screen, all of us in our own homes, all of us connected by this nightmare. Monica was there, the woman who'd reached out to Lena after seeing our wedding announcement. She looked tired and sad, and when she started talking about her baby disappearing 3 years ago, her voice cracked. She described coming home to find James gone with their 8-month-old son and all their savings. She'd filed police reports, but James had vanished completely. The police treated it like a custody dispute, not a kidnapping. Monica had been searching ever since, eventually finding other women online who had similar stories. 3 other women shared their experiences, and the pattern was impossible to ignore. All of them had met men who used different names but similar backgrounds. All of them had babies who vanished around 8 months old. All of them had been left with nothing while their partners disappeared. We sat in silence after the last woman finished talking, just looking at each other's faces on screen. The support group had been meeting for 2 years, trying to find their children, trying to get law enforcement to take them seriously. Now with James arrested and the investigation active, they finally had hope. But that hope was mixed with fear about what we might find. The following week, Teresa brought a woman named Riley Foster to meet me at a family services building across town. Riley was maybe in her 40s with calm eyes and a gentle voice. She explained she was a child welfare specialist who worked with families in complex custody situations. If we located my biological daughter, we'd need a careful plan for introduction and transition. Riley talked about attachment theory and how children form primary bonds with their caregivers. She explained that even though my biological daughter might be living with another family due to the embryo switch, she would have formed attachments to those caregivers. We couldn't just remove her suddenly without causing serious trauma. Riley described a process of gradual introduction, where I'd start with supervised visits, then build up to longer periods together, letting the child adjust slowly. She talked about trauma-informed care and the importance of maintaining stability and routine. I took notes even though my hands were shaking because this was real. We were planning for finding my daughter. Riley said the process could take months or even years depending on the child's age and how bonded she was to her current family. She warned me that some transitions never result in full custody change because courts prioritize the child's well-being over biological relationships. 2 days later, Teresa called and asked me to come to the FBI office to review an interrogation transcript. She handed me a thick folder containing the printed transcript of Sarah Hanley's first interview with federal agents. I read through page after page of Sarah denying everything. She claimed she didn't know anything about embryo switching. She said her after-hours access was for legitimate work catching up on documentation. She insisted she'd never taken money from anyone. But then on page 47, an agent asked her about a specific date in March 2021, and Sarah said she wasn't even working that weekend. The agent pointed out that her badge access showed she was in the lab at 3 a.m. that Saturday. Sarah tried to backtrack, saying she must have misremembered, but the damage was done. She'd just proved she was lying about her access patterns. Teresa explained this slip gave them probable cause to get warrants for Sarah's financial records, phone records, and personal devices. Reading the transcript felt strange, like watching a crime show except these were real people, and my life was part of the case file. 2 weeks into the investigation, Teresa called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at my parents' house with Willow. James had provided the name and location of one of the buyer intermediaries, a man operating out of Arizona. Federal agents had moved fast and recovered a missing child who'd been living with a family who thought they'd done a legal private adoption. The child was safe and being reunited with her biological mother. Teresa said this was a huge breakthrough because it validated James's information and gave them leverage to pressure other intermediaries. I felt this wave of relief that a child was safe, but it was immediately followed by guilt. Why wasn't it my child? Why were other families getting reunited while I still had no idea where my biological daughter was? Teresa must have heard something in my voice because she reminded me that every recovery brought them closer to finding all the missing children. The investigation was moving forward and James was cooperating because he wanted that reduced sentence. Later that same day, Teresa came to my parents' house to talk to me in person. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and said something I needed to understand. Recovering a child doesn't automatically mean reunification with biological parents. Family courts move slowly because they prioritize children's best interests above everything else. If a child has been living with a family for years and has bonded with them, a judge might decide that removing the child would cause more harm than leaving them in place. The legal process could take months or years. Some children might never be returned to their biological parents if the court determines they're better off staying where they are. Teresa's honesty hurt, but I needed to hear it. She wasn't trying to crush my hope. She was preparing me for reality. The legal system wasn't designed for situations like this where embryos were deliberately switched, and children were placed with families who had no idea they weren't raising their biological kids. Later that week, Lena came over to my parents' house and asked if she could babysit Willow under the CPS-approved supervision plan. I talked it through with Riley first, who said supervised visits with family members were encouraged as long as CPS signed off. I agreed and watched Lena settle into the rocking chair with Willow in her arms. She whispered to Willow about how much she loved her, how she'd always protect her. I saw something I hadn't fully appreciated before. My sister had risked everything to save this baby. She'd been arrested, jailed, publicly labeled as dangerous and unstable. She'd done all that knowing it might destroy her relationship with our family, and she'd done it anyway because she knew Willow was in danger. The boundaries between us felt different now, less tangled with old resentments and more based on respect. Lena had proven herself in the most extreme way possible, and I was finally seeing her clearly. The next week, Teresa showed me email evidence recovered from the Arizona intermediary's computer. The emails used coded language, but the pattern was obvious once you knew what to look for. References to Healthy 8 meant babies around 8 months old. Premium placement meant wealthy buyers willing to pay more. Clean documentation meant forged birth certificates and adoption papers. They discussed children like products with features and price points. Reading the clinical language made my skin crawl. These people were buying and selling babies, and they talked about it like a business transaction. I had to step outside Teresa's office and stand in the hallway taking deep breaths, because the reality of what James had been part of was overwhelming. 3 weeks after James's arrest, Martina called me from the clinic. She said the board of directors had voted to fund independent third-party audits of all their procedures and protocols. They were also establishing a fund to cover costs for affected families, including therapy, legal fees, and child welfare expenses. I listened to her explain the details, and then I asked her for a referral to a lawyer who specializes in medical malpractice and fertility law. Martina didn't hesitate. She provided 3 names and offered to have her assistant send me their contact information. She probably knew lawsuits were coming from multiple families, and the clinic needed to show they were taking responsibility. I thanked her and hung up, then immediately called the first lawyer on the list to schedule a consultation. That afternoon, I sat at my laptop with Willow napping in the next room, waiting for the video call to start. The moderator appeared first, a woman named Dr. Hanley, who explained the ground rules for this first contact session between me and Eloisa Waters. Then Eloisa's face filled half my screen, and I saw a woman about my age with dark hair pulled back and red eyes like she'd been crying for days. The moderator asked us to start by sharing basic information about our pregnancies and births. I went first, describing my due date, the emergency C-section at 37 weeks, how Willow spent 5 days in the NICU because her blood sugar dropped. Eloisa nodded and started talking about her own delivery, also at 37 weeks, also a C-section, and her baby girl had the same NICU stay for the same reason. We both stopped talking and just stared at each other through the screen. The moderator gently prompted us to continue, asking about physical features. I described Willow's birthmark on her left shoulder blade, shaped like a comma. Eloise's voice broke when she said her daughter was supposed to have that same birthmark, that it ran in her family, that her mother had it too. I felt something crack open in my chest. We compared medical histories, both babies having the same rare blood type, both showing the same early teeth pattern. Eloisa started crying, and then I was crying too, and the moderator kept reminding us to breathe, to take breaks if we needed them. But neither of us wanted to stop. We talked for 90 minutes, way longer than the scheduled hour, comparing every detail we could think of. By the end, I knew in my gut that Eloisa was Willow's biological mother, and somewhere out there her biological daughter was living with another family who had no idea. The call ended, and I sat staring at the blank screen, feeling like I'd just met the person who was going to change my entire life. 2 days later, I drove to Riley's office for a follow-up meeting about what happens next if the DNA testing confirms what we both already know. Riley had prepared a thick packet of information about gradual introduction plans for situations like this. She walked me through the recommended approach, talking about how young children need consistency and routine, how disruption to primary attachment figures can cause serious developmental trauma. The plan she outlined started with supervised visits where Eloisa would spend a few hours with Willow while I stayed present, then gradually building toward longer visits, overnight stays, and eventually a shared custody arrangement. Riley emphasized that this process typically takes months, sometimes over a year, because the priority is Willow's emotional well-being above everything else. She showed me research studies about attachment and child development, explaining why rushing the process could harm Willow even though everyone involved wants answers quickly. I listened and took notes and tried to focus on the logic of what she was saying, but inside I felt like I was reading instructions for how to slowly lose my daughter. Riley must have seen something in my face because she stopped mid-sentence and told me this was about adding another parent to Willow's life, not replacing me. I nodded, but I didn't believe her. The plan was thoughtful and careful, and made perfect sense from a child welfare perspective, but it still felt like preparing to have my heart ripped out in slow motion. The next morning, a letter arrived from the county jail with James's inmate number stamped on the envelope. I held it for maybe 5 seconds before driving straight to Teresa's office and handing it over unopened. She took it with gloved hands and logged it into the evidence system, explaining that any communication from James could be relevant to the case. I told her I didn't care what he had to say, that I was done letting him have any access to my emotional life. Teresa nodded and said that was probably the healthiest choice I could make. She added the letter to a growing file of evidence, and I walked out feeling lighter, like I'd just set down a weight I'd been carrying. That same week, Teresa called me to her office to explain what the FBI's financial forensics team had found. They'd traced wire transfers from what looked like legitimate charity organizations into the embryology tech's personal bank account, small amounts spread out over 18 months. Teresa pulled up spreadsheets on her computer showing the pattern, each payment between $200 and $500, coming every few weeks like clockwork. She said these microcredits were probably designed to stay under the radar of automatic fraud detection systems that flag larger suspicious transactions. The total added up to almost $40,000. I stared at the numbers feeling sick, realizing someone had paid that much money to deliberately switch embryos and destroy families. Teresa explained they were now backtracking every charity to identify the actual source of the funds, building a paper trail that would connect the tech to the trafficking network. The level of planning involved, the careful, systematic approach to hiding the payments, made everything feel more calculated and evil than I'd even imagined. 4 weeks after the investigation started, I was scrolling through news alerts on my phone when I saw the headline about a fertility clinic employee arrested in another state. The article didn't name the clinic, but I knew immediately it was about our case. I called Teresa, and she confirmed that federal agents had picked up the former embryology tech at her new job that morning. Within hours, Martina sent an email to all affected patients explaining that several current staff members were being placed on administrative leave pending the audit results, and that the clinic would issue a full public statement. I spent the rest of the day reading news coverage online, seeing my private nightmare turn into headlines and comment sections. Strangers were debating fertility clinic regulations and embryo handling protocols, and somewhere in all those words was my life falling apart, reduced to a cautionary tale about medical oversight. The following week, Riley coordinated the DNA sample collection for both me and Eloisa, setting up appointments at different approved labs to maintain chain of custody protocols. She explained that proper documentation now would prevent legal disputes later, when custody arrangements got formalized. I showed up at the lab and a technician swabbed the inside of my cheek, the whole process taking maybe 2 minutes. The swab itself was simple. Just a long Q-tip scraped against my gums, but sitting in that sterile room, I couldn't stop thinking about what the results would mean. Riley said we'd have answers within a week. 7 days to find out if my worst fear was confirmed, if Willow was biologically Eloisa's daughter, and I was raising a child who belonged to someone else. 5 weeks into the investigation, Teresa called with an update that 2 more missing children had been located using information from James's buyer list. She didn't give me details about where or how, just said the FBI was coordinating with local authorities in 2 different states. That evening, the mother's support group chat exploded with messages. Monica posted that she'd received a credible lead about her son's possible location in the Pacific Northwest, that investigators were following up on a family who'd adopted a boy matching his description and timeline. The chat filled with crying emojis and prayer hands and messages of hope, mixed with fear about what happens if they actually find these kids. I read through everything feeling this weird combination of happiness for the progress and guilt that my situation was moving faster than theirs. Around the same time, Vincent called to explain the deal he'd negotiated with James's legal team. James would appear before a grand jury and provide testimony against the supply chain operators and buyers in exchange for reduced sentencing recommendations. Vincent was careful to emphasize that reduced didn't mean eliminated, that James would still face significant prison time, probably 15 to 20 years minimum. He said this was as good as it gets given how serious the crimes were and how much information James had to trade. I asked if we had any choice in whether the deal happened, and Vincent said technically no, that prosecutorial discretion meant his office made these decisions, but that he wanted me to understand the reasoning. I told him I understood, even though part of me wanted James to rot in prison forever. That night, the support group chat turned into an intense debate about whether plea deals were actually justice or just the system taking shortcuts. Some of the mothers wanted maximum punishment for everyone involved, full trials and life sentences, and no mercy. Others argued that getting children back quickly mattered more than revenge, that plea deals meant faster resolutions and less trauma for the kids. I watched the conversation go back and forth for hours, different women sharing their perspectives, some getting angry, others trying to mediate. I finally typed that I was somewhere in the middle, that I wanted both justice and results, that it shouldn't be an either-or choice. Several people liked my comment, but the debate kept going, everyone processing their pain differently. 6 weeks after Willow's initial DNA test, Teresa called and asked me to come to her office. I knew from her voice what she was going to tell me. I drove there with my hands gripping the steering wheel too tight, walked through the FBI building on autopilot, sat down across from Teresa's desk. She pulled out a folder and opened it and told me the results had come back confirming that Eloisa Waters was Willow's biological mother. The DNA match was definitive. No room for error or doubt. I sat there feeling the room tilt sideways. Everything I'd feared for the past 6 weeks suddenly real and confirmed. Teresa kept talking, explaining next steps and legal procedures and coordination with Riley's office, but her voice sounded far away. I'd known this was coming, had been preparing myself, but somehow I still wasn't ready for the actual moment of hearing it said out loud. Everything I'd feared was true, and no amount of preparation had made it hurt any less. I walked through the FBI building's front entrance the next morning, Willow strapped to my chest in her carrier, and took the elevator to Teresa's floor. Riley was already in the conference room when I arrived, sitting with folders spread across the table and a gentle smile on her face. She stood up to greet me, introduced herself properly since we'd only talked on the phone before, then gestured for me to sit down. Riley explained that she'd been coordinating with Eloisa for the past week, that Eloisa was anxious but willing to follow whatever guidelines Riley recommended. The meeting was scheduled for next Thursday at the Family Services Building, in a room designed specifically for supervised child interactions. Riley would be there the whole time, observing how Willow responded to Eloisa's presence and voice. She handed me a packet of information about attachment theory and what to expect during first contact situations. I took the papers and nodded, trying to focus on her words while Willow squirmed against my chest. Riley said the goal wasn't to force any immediate bond, just to let Willow see Eloisa's face and hear her voice in a safe environment. I asked what I should do if Willow cried or seemed scared, and Riley said to trust my instincts as her primary caregiver. The conversation lasted 40 minutes, and by the end I felt slightly less terrified but still completely unprepared. I left the building and drove home, spent the afternoon playing with Willow on the floor, trying not to think about next Thursday. That night I couldn't sleep, kept rehearsing what I'd say to Eloisa, how I'd act, whether I should smile or stay serious. The next 7 days crawled by with this horrible weight in my chest, knowing the meeting was coming but unable to speed up or slow down time. Teresa called on Monday morning and asked if I could stop by her office that afternoon. I arranged for my mom to watch Willow and drove to the FBI building again, wondering what new information she'd found. Teresa was sitting at her desk with a thick file open in front of her when I walked in. She closed it and looked at me with this expression that was both kind and sad at the same time. She said she needed to prepare me for something, that the investigation into my biological daughter's location was progressing, but would likely take significantly longer than resolving Willow's situation. They had leads, she explained, but nothing confirmed yet. James had provided some information about the trafficking network's structure, but tracking down specific children took time. She said the out-of-state agencies were coordinating, but these cases moved slowly by design to protect the children involved. I sat there listening and nodding like I understood, like I was fine with waiting. Teresa kept talking about timelines and protocols and interagency cooperation. Inside my head, I was screaming, wanting to demand why finding my biological daughter had to take longer, why Willow's situation got priority. But I knew the answer already. Willow was here, safe, with clear DNA results connecting her to Eloisa. My biological daughter was somewhere unknown, possibly with people who had no idea they were raising a switched child. The situations weren't comparable, even though they felt equally urgent to me. Teresa asked if I had questions and I shook my head, not trusting my voice. She said she'd keep me updated on every development, that they weren't giving up or deprioritizing my case. I thanked her and left, sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes just breathing. Thursday arrived and I drove to the Family Services Building with Willow, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The building was newer than I expected, with bright colors on the walls and children's artwork displayed in frames. Riley met me in the lobby and walked me to a room on the second floor. The space was set up like a playroom, with soft mats on the floor, toys organized in bins along the walls, and a camera mounted discreetly in one corner for documentation purposes. Riley explained the camera was standard protocol, that recordings helped track progress and protect everyone involved. Eloisa was already there, sitting in a chair near the window, and she stood up when we entered. She looked younger than I'd imagined, maybe late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and nervous energy radiating off her. We made eye contact and both tried to smile, these awkward attempts at being normal in a completely abnormal situation. Riley gestured for me to sit on the mat with Willow, and Eloisa sat in a chair about 6 feet away. I unstrapped Willow from her carrier and set her on the mat with some soft blocks nearby. Riley started talking in this calm, measured voice about how we'd proceed, that Eloisa would just sit quietly at first while Willow played. Willow grabbed a block and shook it, making the rattling sound she loved. I said her name and she turned toward my voice immediately, reaching for me the way she always did. Then Eloisa spoke. Just a soft hello, and Willow's head swiveled toward the sound. She stared at Eloisa with this intense curiosity, her little face serious and focused. Eloisa's eyes filled with tears and she covered her mouth with her hand. Riley asked if Eloisa wanted to move a little closer, and Eloisa nodded, sliding down to sit on the floor about 4 feet from us. Willow kept staring, not scared exactly, just studying this new person. I felt this horrible tightness in my chest watching them look at each other, knowing Eloisa was Willow's biological mother, but I was the one Willow knew and trusted. There were no easy answers in this moment, no clear right thing to do or say, just two women who loved the same baby, and a child who didn't understand any of it. After the meeting ended, Riley walked me to my car while Eloisa stayed inside to talk with another caseworker. Riley said the first contact had gone well, that Willow's response was healthy and age-appropriate. She scheduled another meeting for the following week, slightly longer this time. I drove home feeling emotionally exhausted, put Willow down for a nap, then sat at my kitchen table staring at nothing. Later that afternoon, I had a consultation scheduled with a family court attorney that my mom had recommended. The lawyer's office was downtown in a tall building with marble floors and expensive furniture in the waiting room. The attorney was a woman in her 50s named Barbara Hanley, and she had this no-nonsense way of talking that I appreciated. She asked detailed questions about the DNA results, the IVF clinic situation, my relationship with Willow since birth. I answered everything as clearly as I could, showing her the documentation I'd brought. Barbara explained that family courts would apply something called the best interest of the child standard, which meant judges considered multiple factors beyond just biological parentage. Continuity of care mattered significantly, she said, especially for an infant who'd already formed primary attachments. She talked about psychological parent doctrine and how courts tried to minimize disruption to children's established bonds. The legal analysis was complex, with case law precedents and statutory considerations I barely followed. But the basic message came through clearly. Willow would probably stay primarily with me while Eloisa gained gradual involvement in her life. It wouldn't be a sudden custody swap, but rather a carefully managed transition that protected Willow's emotional well-being. Barbara said she couldn't make promises about outcomes, but based on the facts I'd presented, I had a strong position. The relief I felt was immediate and overwhelming, followed instantly by guilt. I was relieved about keeping Willow, which meant I was relieved about limiting Eloisa's time with her biological daughter. The contradictions made my head hurt. 7 weeks after James's arrest, Teresa called with news about my biological daughter. James had provided information during a proffer session about the likely location of the couple who'd received my switched embryo. An out-of-state child welfare agency was now involved, conducting their own investigation without alerting the family yet. Teresa said they needed to verify the information first, make sure James wasn't lying or manipulating the system. She warned me not to get my hopes up until they confirmed everything. The waiting was brutal, knowing my biological daughter might be located, but not being able to do anything. I asked Teresa how long verification would take, and she said probably 2 to 3 weeks minimum. They had to access sealed IVF records from another clinic, cross-reference with state birth certificates, possibly conduct surveillance. I hung up the phone and immediately called Lena, needing to tell someone who would understand. Lena listened while I explained everything, then said she'd come over that evening. We sat in my living room after Willow went to sleep, drinking tea and talking about what it would mean if they actually found my biological daughter. Lena asked if I'd thought about names, about what I'd call her, and I realized I hadn't. She was just my biological daughter in my head, this abstract person I was searching for. Lena said I should start thinking about it, about how I'd introduce myself when the time came. Riley called the following week with a draft of the temporary parenting plan she'd been working on. She emailed me a PDF and we went through it together over the phone. The plan named me as Willow's primary caregiver, with legal custody remaining with me for now. Eloisa would have structured visitations starting with 2 supervised visits per week, each lasting 2 hours. After a month, if things went well, visits would increase to 3 times per week, and could happen at Eloisa's home with a social worker present. The plan included provisions for gradually building toward overnight visits, but not for at least 6 months. Riley explained that the slow progression was designed to protect Willow's attachment security, while giving Eloisa meaningful time to build a relationship with her biological daughter. There were sections about communication protocols, how Eloisa and I would coordinate about Willow's care and medical needs. Reading through it felt surreal, seeing my life with Willow reduced to legal clauses and visitation schedules. But I also felt grateful that someone was thinking carefully about how to handle this impossible situation. I signed the document electronically that afternoon, my hand shaking as I typed my name. The plan would go to a judge for approval, Riley said, but that was mostly a formality given the circumstances. I felt both grateful for the structure and heartbroken that we needed it. 8 weeks after everything started, Lena and I sat in a therapist's office for our first joint session. The therapist was a woman named Dr. Wooten, who specialized in family trauma and conflict resolution. She had us sit in comfortable chairs facing each other, with her positioned slightly to the side. Dr. Wooten started by asking us each to describe our relationship before the kidnapping crisis, and Lena went first. She talked about how our parents always treated her like she was overreacting to things, how they'd dismiss her concerns and make her feel crazy. Lena said she'd spent years trying to get them to take her seriously about anything, and by the time she discovered the truth about James, she knew they wouldn't believe her. She looked at me and said I'd been part of that pattern too, that I'd sided with our parents more often than I'd defended her. The words hurt, but I couldn't deny them. When it was my turn, I talked about how I'd felt caught between Lena and our parents, how I'd tried to keep the peace instead of standing up for what was right. I admitted I'd failed her in a lot of ways, that I'd let our parents' judgment of her become my judgment too. Dr. Wooten asked specific questions about particular incidents, making us go deeper into the resentment that had built up over years. Lena brought up a time when she was 16, and our parents had accused her of lying about something, and I'd stayed silent even though I knew she was telling the truth. I brought up times when Lena had been genuinely difficult or dramatic, trying to explain why I'd sometimes doubted her. We went back and forth like this for 90 minutes, crying and angry and exhausted. Dr. Wooten didn't try to fix anything or declare anyone right or wrong. She just helped us articulate the pain we'd been carrying. By the end of the session, nothing was resolved, but somehow speaking it all out loud made it feel slightly more manageable. We scheduled another appointment for 2 weeks later. Teresa called me on a Tuesday morning to say the FBI had successfully flipped one of the buyer intermediaries. The man had agreed to cooperate in exchange for witness protection, providing detailed information about how the trafficking network operated. Teresa said this was a major breakthrough that would significantly strengthen the case against multiple defendants. She explained that the intermediary had records of transactions, names of other network members, and information about how buyers were recruited. Federal prosecutors were already using the information to build additional cases. I asked if this helped find my biological daughter, and Teresa said indirectly, yes, that the intermediary's information included details about which clinic employees worked with which buyers. I felt satisfaction hearing about the progress, but it was muted by exhaustion. Every piece of good news came with a reminder of how much damage had been done, how many people had been hurt. Teresa said she'd keep me updated as more arrests happened. I thanked her and hung up, then sat on my couch staring at Willow playing on her mat. She was getting bigger every day, developing her own personality, completely unaware of the legal machinery grinding away to sort out her life. 9 weeks into this nightmare, Martina called a meeting with all the affected patients from my IVF treatment cycle. She'd rented a conference room at a hotel and hired a mediator to facilitate the discussion. When I arrived, there were 6 other couples there, all looking as shell-shocked as I felt. Martina stood at the front of the room and announced that the clinic was establishing a civil settlement fund to cover therapy costs, legal fees, and child welfare expenses for everyone affected by the embryo switching. She said they were taking full responsibility for the breach in protocols that had allowed this to happen. The mediator explained how the fund would work, what expenses would be covered, how we'd submit claims. I listened, but felt increasingly skeptical about whether the clinic's self-determined compensation would be adequate. After the meeting, I called the attorney my mom had recommended and asked about retaining separate representation for a potential lawsuit. Barbara said I definitely had grounds for a substantial civil case, that the clinic's negligence was clear, and the damages were significant. She explained that accepting the settlement fund wouldn't necessarily prevent me from pursuing additional legal action, but I should document everything carefully. I hired her that afternoon, feeling like I was adding another layer to an already complicated situation, but I couldn't trust the clinic to fairly determine what my family deserved after what they'd allowed to happen. I spent the entire weekend at my kitchen table drafting an impact statement for the prosecutor to use at James's bail hearings and eventual sentencing. Vincent had sent me a template and some guidelines about what to include. I started by describing what my life was like before I found out the truth. The shock of discovering James wasn't who he claimed to be. I wrote about the DNA results, learning Willow wasn't my biological daughter, the ongoing trauma of not knowing where my biological daughter was. I described how James's crimes had destroyed my sense of safety and trust, how I questioned every relationship and every memory. I wrote about the fear I felt knowing he'd been planning to sell Willow, that my sister had saved her life by kidnapping her. The words came slowly at first, then faster as I got into it. I wrote about the impact on my parents, on Lena who'd been arrested and jailed for trying to protect us. I wrote about Eloisa and the impossible situation we were navigating together, both of us victims of the same system. The statement ended up being 4 pages long, single-spaced, every sentence packed with specific details about how James's actions had affected my life. Writing it out was brutal, forcing me to confront everything that had happened and articulate it clearly. But it was also empowering in a weird way. This was my voice in the legal process, my chance to make sure the judge understood exactly what James had done. I printed 3 copies, signed each one, and mailed them to Vincent's office on Monday morning. 10 weeks after the investigation began, Riley called while I was feeding Willow breakfast. She said they located a child matching my biological daughter's profile and timeline at an out-of-state welfare agency. They were sending preliminary photos through secure channels within the hour. My hands shook so badly I had to put down the spoon and grip the edge of the kitchen table. I thanked Riley and hung up, then sat there staring at my phone like it might explode. The photos arrived 43 minutes later via encrypted email. I opened the attachment on my laptop and stared at a little girl with my mother's nose and my dark curly hair, the same widow's peak I had as a kid. The medical records attached showed she had the same rare blood marker that runs in my family, the one that only shows up in about 2% of the population. I knew in my bones this was my biological daughter, but I also knew we were still far from bringing her home. The legal coordination alone would take months, maybe longer. 11 weeks in, Vincent called to tell me James was trying to retract his cooperation, unless they moved him to a different facility immediately. He claimed other inmates were threatening him because word got out about his crimes involving children. Vincent held firm on the original agreement but said he was negotiating with the jail administration for better safety measures. When I called Teresa in a panic, she told me this kind of manipulation was typical, and I shouldn't worry. James was just testing boundaries to see if he could squeeze more concessions out of the system. She said Vincent knew what he was doing and the deal would hold. I wanted to believe her but spent the rest of that day feeling sick to my stomach. The next week, Eloisa came for her second visit with Willow. This time went more smoothly than the first. Willow recognized her scent when Eloisa picked her up and reached for her hair, wrapping her tiny fingers around the dark strands. I stepped back and let them have space together in the playroom, watching through the doorway as Eloisa sang softly, and Willow studied her face. When Willow started fussing 15 minutes later, I came back in and she reached for me immediately. Afterward, Riley sat down with both of us to talk about how we were managing the shared stewardship that was starting to develop. She used that exact word, stewardship, like we were both caretakers of something precious that didn't fully belong to either of us. 3 months after James's arrest, the grand jury returned formal indictments that expanded the charges way beyond what I expected. The list included conspiracy counts against the clinic tech, multiple buyer intermediaries, and several shell company operators who helped move money and falsify documents. Reading through the indictment felt like watching dominoes fall, each name representing another piece of the network that had stolen children and destroyed families. Vincent sent me a copy of the full document, 37 pages of legal language that basically said a lot of people were going down for this. The DNA results for the out-of-state child came back 2 weeks later, confirming she was my biological daughter. Her name was currently Sophie, and she was raised by a couple who had done IVF at a different clinic and had no idea they were raising a switched child. Court coordination began immediately to figure out how to handle notification and transition. Riley explained that the approach had to be careful because this couple had no involvement in the crime and believed Sophie was their biological daughter. The judge assigned to the case would have to balance everyone's rights while prioritizing Sophie's well-being. Riley worked with the out-of-state welfare agency to draft a travel plan for supervised introductions between me and Sophie. The approach would be slow and trauma-informed, prioritizing Sophie's attachment to her current caregivers while beginning to build connection with me. I would fly out next month for the first meeting in a neutral location with both families present and a child psychologist observing. The plan outlined a timeline stretching over at least 6 months before any custody decisions would be made. 4 months after everything started, James entered a formal plea agreement that was contingent on his full cooperation in debriefing sessions and testimony at trial. Vincent called to explain that the deal reduced James's potential sentence significantly, but guaranteed he would still serve substantial time. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was real accountability. The alternative was going to trial and risking an acquittal on some charges, which could mean James getting out sooner. Teresa shared a summary of James's proffer sessions the following week, sitting across from me at a coffee shop and walking me through the highlights. The sessions included names of buyers, descriptions of trafficking routes through 3 different states, and anonymized profiles of wealthy clients who purchased children through the network. Law enforcement agencies in multiple states were planning coordinated operations to arrest buyers and recover more missing children. The scope of what James helped expose was staggering. Teresa said they estimated at least 20 children were trafficked through this particular network over the past 5 years. 5 months after the initial crisis, we had a family court hearing where a judge reviewed and ratified the temporary parenting plan for Willow. The judge was a woman in her 60s who listened carefully to Riley's recommendations and reviewed all the documentation before making her decision. She acknowledged Eloisa's legal rights as biological mother, while recognizing my role as Willow's primary attachment figure. The judge said the plan balanced everyone's interests appropriately and would be reviewed again in 6 months. It was validation, but it also felt strange having our family situation broken down and analyzed in legal terms, like we were specimens under a microscope instead of real people trying to do right by a child we both loved. 2 weeks later, I boarded a plane heading west with Riley sitting beside me to help manage the first supervised visit with Sophie. The flight felt endless even though it was only 3 hours, and I kept checking my phone for photos the out-of-state agency had sent. Sophie had my dark curly hair and my mother's nose, but her eyes were different, lighter than mine, maybe from her father's side of my biological family. Riley reminded me 3 times during the flight to let Sophie control the pace of interaction and not to expect immediate bonding. The meeting was scheduled at a neutral child services building with Sophie's current caregivers present and a child psychologist observing everything. When we arrived at the building, my hands were shaking, so badly I could barely sign in at the front desk. The room they led us to had soft lighting and toys scattered across a playmat, and then Sophie walked in holding her caregiver's hand. She was beautiful and shy, wearing a yellow dress with flowers on it, and she immediately pressed herself against the woman's leg when she saw me and Riley. The caregiver introduced herself as Barbara, and explained that Sophie had been told a nice lady was coming to visit, but they kept the explanation simple given her age. I sat down on the floor near the toys like Riley had coached me to do, keeping my distance and letting Sophie decide if she wanted to approach. Sophie watched me for maybe 5 minutes, just staring with those light eyes, and then she toddled over to grab a stuffed elephant near my knee. I smiled at her but didn't reach out, just commented on how cute the elephant was. She clutched it and backed away to Barbara again. The whole visit lasted 45 minutes, and Sophie came close to me maybe 4 times total, always returning to Barbara's arms when she felt uncertain. By the end, I was crying quietly while trying to hide it, and Riley squeezed my shoulder as we prepared to leave. Barbara was kind, saying Sophie did really well for a first meeting, but I felt like I'd just met a stranger who happened to share my DNA. The flight home was worse than the flight there because now I knew exactly what I was dealing with. Back home 3 days later, Eloisa came over in the evening after Willow was asleep, and we sat at my kitchen table with blank paper and pens between us. We'd both agreed through our lawyers that we needed a written agreement about how we'd handle communication and visits and decisions about Willow's care going forward. The legal custody arrangement was clear, but we wanted something more personal that spelled out our actual day-to-day relationship. Eloisa started by suggesting we outline basic communication norms, like responding to texts within 24 hours, unless there was an emergency, and I wrote that down. Then I added that major medical decisions should involve both of us, and she nodded and added educational choices too. We cried while writing some of it, especially the part about how we'd explain things to Willow as she got older, but we also laughed at unexpected moments. Eloisa made a joke about how we were basically writing a co-parenting agreement without ever having dated, and I laughed so hard I snorted. We worked for 3 hours, stopping twice to make tea and once to just sit in silence when the emotions got too heavy. The final document was 4 pages long and covered everything from holiday schedules to how we'd introduce each other to Willow verbally as she developed language. It wasn't legally binding, but we both signed it anyway and made copies. Eloisa hugged me before she left, and it felt strange but also right. 6 months after everything started, I sat in a conference room at the IVF clinic for a civil mediation session. Martina was there with 3 lawyers from the clinic's legal team, and I had my own attorney beside me. The mediator was a woman in her 50s who explained we were here to discuss restitution categories without admitting fault for litigation purposes. My lawyer had prepared me for how clinical this would feel, but hearing them break down my trauma into dollar amounts still made my stomach turn. They discussed therapy costs first, with Martina's team offering to cover up to 50 sessions for me and any affected family members. Then they moved to legal fees, and there was back and forth about what qualified as directly related to the embryo switching versus the trafficking case. Lost wages came next, and I had to provide documentation of the shifts I'd missed at the hospital. The lawyers talked about funds for the children's future needs, suggesting trust accounts that would be accessible for education and medical expenses. Everything was spreadsheets and categories and calculated amounts, and I kept thinking about how none of this money would undo what happened. My lawyer pushed for higher numbers than the clinic initially offered, and Martina looked pained during some of the exchanges but didn't argue against the increases. The mediation lasted 4 hours, and by the end we had a preliminary framework that would go back to both legal teams for refinement. I signed some initial agreements and left feeling like I'd just sold pieces of my life for cash. The pre-sentencing hearing happened 2 weeks later in a federal courtroom with James sitting at the defense table 20 feet away from me. I'd practiced reading my impact statement with my therapist, but actually doing it in front of James was different. My hands shook holding the paper and I had to stop twice to breathe. I described coming home to find Willow missing, discovering James's lies, learning that the daughter I'd raised wasn't biologically mine. I explained how my sister was arrested for trying to protect Willow, and how that trauma compounded everything else. James didn't look at me the entire time I spoke, just stared at the table in front of him. When I finished, Lena was called up to give her statement. She described being handcuffed at the bus station, spending days in jail, being called unstable and dangerous when she was actually the only person who saw the truth. Her voice broke when she talked about watching them take Willow away at the station, and not knowing if she'd ever see her again. The judge listened carefully and took notes, asking a few clarifying questions but mostly just absorbing our words. The prosecutor presented the cooperation agreement and James's debriefing contributions, and the defense attorney argued for leniency based on his assistance. The whole hearing lasted 3 hours, and I left feeling like our voices had finally mattered in a system that usually made us feel invisible. 3 days after the hearing, Teresa called to tell me that James's final intelligence briefing had led federal agents to a family in Oregon, where Monica's son had been living for 3 years. The family had adopted him through what they thought were legal channels, having no idea he was actually a trafficked child. Monica sent a message to the support group chat that just said she never thought she'd see him again, followed by about 30 crying emojis. The group chat exploded with messages of celebration and relief, everyone typing over each other about how this was proof that the investigation was actually working. I felt genuine joy for the first time in months, not the complicated relief or guilty gratitude I'd been experiencing, but actual happiness that Monica would be reunited with her son. The group decided to have a video call that evening to celebrate together, and seeing everyone's faces light up reminded me that we were all in this together. Someone suggested we send flowers to Monica, and within an hour we'd pooled money and placed an order. It felt good to celebrate something unambiguously positive. 7 months after James's arrest, he was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. I sat in the courtroom gallery with Lena beside me, watching the judge deliver the sentence. The maximum had been 30 years, but the cooperation agreement reduced it substantially. The judge acknowledged James's assistance in recovering children and dismantling the trafficking network, but also emphasized the severity of his crimes and the lasting harm to victims. James would serve his time in a facility with protective custody because of the nature of his crimes involving children. 18 years meant he'd be in his 50s when he got out, assuming good behavior didn't reduce it further. It wasn't everything I'd wanted, but it was substantial time, and it kept him away from children during years when he could have continued his pattern. Lena squeezed my hand when the judge announced the sentence, and I felt some of the tension I'd been carrying for months finally release. James was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, and I didn't feel satisfaction exactly, but I felt closure on that particular chapter. The other sentences came down over the following weeks. The buyer intermediary who'd flipped and cooperated received 5 years, which felt light but was apparently standard for cooperation deals. The embryology tech who'd actually switched the embryos accepted a plea deal for 7 years, plus restitution payments to affected families. Martina held a press conference to announce the clinic's policy overhauls, including new security protocols with dual verification for all embryo handling and mandatory oversight reviews. I watched the press conference online and felt that the reforms were inadequate given what had happened, but I also understood they were necessary steps to prevent future incidents. The news coverage was extensive, with multiple outlets running stories about the trafficking ring and the embryo switching scandal. My name was kept confidential in most reports, but some of the other affected families went public with their stories. 8 months into this nightmare, Eloisa began having unsupervised time with Willow. We started with just a few hours on weekend afternoons, with Eloisa taking Willow to the park or her apartment. I monitored my own reactions in therapy, working through the grief of losing exclusive motherhood while trying to support Willow's relationship with her biological mother. Some days were harder than others. I'd watch Eloisa buckle Willow into her car seat and feel panic rising in my chest, even though I knew rationally that Eloisa wasn't going to disappear with her. My therapist helped me identify the difference between reasonable caution and trauma-driven anxiety. After 6 weeks of successful afternoon visits, we progressed to overnight stays, and that first night without Willow in the house felt impossible. I checked my phone every hour and barely slept, but Eloisa sent photos and updates, and when I picked Willow up the next morning, she was happy and healthy. The overnights gradually became routine. 9 months after everything began, Eloisa and I met with both our attorneys and Riley to formalize a permanent parenting plan. The plan named me as Willow's legal guardian with full custody, while giving Eloisa substantial ongoing involvement in her life. There would be no abrupt custody swap, just continued gradual integration where Willow would have 2 mothers who coordinated and communicated about her care. The arrangement wasn't traditional, but it was what worked for us and prioritized Willow's stability. Riley emphasized that as Willow got older, we'd need to be prepared to explain the situation in age-appropriate ways, and potentially adjust the arrangement based on Willow's needs and preferences. Both attorneys reviewed the document carefully, and we all signed it in Riley's office. Eloisa and I hugged afterward, and I felt grateful that we'd found a way to navigate this impossible situation with grace. Sophie's caregivers and I worked out a similar gradual arrangement through the Out-of-State Family Services Agency. Sophie would begin scheduled overnight visits with me while maintaining her relationship with Barbara and her husband, who'd raised her since the embryo switch. The transitions were carefully paced to minimize trauma, with a child psychologist monitoring Sophie's adjustment at each stage. I flew out once a month for visits, and Barbara sent photos and videos between trips. The arrangement felt achingly slow, but I understood it was necessary. I was learning that being a mother sometimes meant prioritizing your child's emotional needs over your own desperate desire to have them with you immediately. Sophie was bonding with me gradually, and that was enough for now. 2 weeks later, my lawyer called to say the clinic's settlement was finalized. The money would go into special accounts for therapy costs, legal bills, and education funds for both Willow and Sophie. My lawyer got me a good amount, enough to help secure both kids' futures without making it feel like I was trying to profit from the nightmare. It was practical closure, not the emotional kind, but I'd take what I could get. The clinic's insurance company wanted everything signed and sealed fast, probably to avoid more bad press. I signed the papers in my lawyer's office while Willow napped in her carrier next to me. The whole thing felt anticlimactic, just signatures and account numbers, but I guess that's how these things end in real life. 10 months after Lena kidnapped Willow to save her, we had a family gathering at my parents' house. Mom made her usual too much food, and Dad kept fussing with the thermostat like he always does when he's nervous. Lena held Willow on the couch, and Willow grabbed at Lena's necklace and babbled. My parents sat down across from us, and Mom's eyes were already red before she started talking. She said she was sorry for treating Lena like she was always making things up, sorry for not listening when it mattered. Dad nodded and added that they'd been wrong to dismiss her concerns over the years. No conditions, no excuses, just real apologies. We talked for over an hour about communication and respect, about how things needed to be different going forward. Lena cried, I cried, even Dad's voice cracked a little. The healing wasn't complete, probably never would be, but it was real progress built on honesty instead of pretending. Late one night, I stood in the doorway of the room where 2 cribs now sat side by side. Willow and Sophie were both asleep, their breathing steady and peaceful. My calendar on the wall had color-coded schedules for Eloisa's visits and Sophie's caregiver coordination. Purple for Eloisa's days with Willow, green for my trips to see Sophie, blue for when Barbara brought Sophie here. There were no heroes in this story, just people doing their best with an impossible situation that nobody asked for. The plan held, the children were safe, and somehow that was enough.